Whether it's a description, DNA, or physical evidence, a criminal will always leave behind some type of clues to their crime. On the Criminal Prints podcast, we discuss cases with an emphasis on these clues. We call them the criminal prints. I'm Jaron, co-host of the Criminal Prints podcast, and I hope you will check us out on Facebook, Twitter at Podcast Criminal, or listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify. And remember, keep your record clean and your prints off the scene.
The Torso Killer, the New York Ripper, Times Square Killer, all of these names used to describe one man who regularly attacked and mutilated young women. He would murder in the morning or the evening without the fear of repercussions. Sadly, it took over 13 years to arrest the man responsible. This is the case of Richard Cottingham.
Hey listeners, I'm Brittany.
And I'm Hallie.
And thank you for tuning back into the Abyss Pod with us. We're really excited you're joining us for a new episode. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss an episode. And give us that 5-star rating. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at the Abyss Pod. Don't forget to visit our website, theabysspod.com. We have a lot of show notes. We have sources for you to read if you want to learn more about the cases we talk about. We have lots of pictures from the cases, sometimes maps or missing persons, photos, or things like that. So they can really add to your experience of listening to the episode. And if you have any thoughts or opinions or any case suggestions, don't hesitate to get in touch with us.
We promise we don't bite. So let's jump into the abyss. Richard Francis Cottingham was born on November 25th, 1946 in Bronx, New York. He grew up in a religious household, raised in the Catholic Church. He grew up around other kids since he had 3 younger siblings. When Richard was 4, he suffered from a brain injury after being hit by a car. This created some trials in his early childhood, but he had the support of family. When he was 12 years old, he moved with the family to Rivervale, New Jersey. He attended St. Andrews, which is a parochial co-ed school, and had a hard time making friends. He was a unique kid who took up an interest in homing pigeons and working in the yard with his mother. Even though Richard was a strange kid who grew up to have malicious tendencies, he expressed no symptoms of the serial killer triad: no animal abuse, fire starting, or bedwetting. Richard went to high school and became a member of the track team. He chose this sport specifically because it fit his personality. He was able to be a long-distance runner and have solitude and independence. High school did not improve Richard's social ranking very much. He became slightly more accepted by his fellow classmates, but he really just blended in with everybody else. He was still considered a loner and standoffish, even thought to be misogynistic by his peers. Sadly, they weren't far from the truth. Richard was obsessed with the female form as an object and even got into violent bondage pornography. After graduating high school, Richard went to work at his father's life insurance company called Metropolitan Life for the following 4 years. He even took some computer courses relevant to the career to expand his knowledge and skill set. In 1996, he left his father's company to work for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Greater New York as a computer operator. During his young adulthood, Richard frequently visited sex clubs and spent time with prostitutes and was very open about his deviant sexual behaviors and robbery. He told coworkers about how he would lure out prostitutes in Manhattan and take their money and belongings. He even complained to his coworkers about how he got an STD from a prostitute and was furious. The anger swelled more and more over the years in Richard Cottingham until one day he took matters into his own hands.
On October 30th of 1967, Nancy Shiva Vogel, a 29-year-old mother of 2, left her home to play bingo at St. Margaret's Church. Once on her way, she decided to stop at the Valley Fair department store to do some shopping. She made some purchases and put them in her car. The following day, 2 12-year-old girls were returning from school when they saw something strange in a car as they passed. The police were called and the car was inspected. Inside of her own car was the body of Nancy Vogel. She was naked and had been brutally beaten. Her hands were bound in front of her. Her body was partially covered in the back seat, and her clothes were neatly folded underneath her. Police took the folded clothes and the fact that it did not appear that Nancy was forcibly raped to mean that she may have known her killer. After no significant leads in the following week, the police investigation went more or less cold and would stay that way for 43 years, allowing Richard to commit more heinous crimes.
On July 18th, 1968, about 9 months after the horrific discovery of Nancy Vogel, another innocent girl was attacked and found dead. Jacqueline Harp was only 13 years old, and she was walking home from drum and bugle practice. En route, a strange man stopped in his car and offered her a ride home. Richard was not happy when she refused this offer, and he ended up chasing her down before dragging her into the bushes. She was last seen around 9:50 p.m. The Harp family was waiting for Jacqueline to return home, and they just grew more and more concerned as the minutes ticked by. They eventually called the police and reported her missing. The following morning, young Jacqueline Harp was found. She had been strangled and badly beaten, and there was blood on her stomach. Her clothes were in quote-unquote disarray, but she had not been raped. Unfortunately, Richard Cottingham would once again take no blame. About a year later, in April, Irene Blaze, an 18-year-old young lady, decided to spend some time shopping. She was wearing a black long-sleeved shirt and her dark blue jeans, along with her crucifix, necklace, and high school class ring. She bumped into a fellow who asked her to grab a drink, and she agreed, completely unaware that she had encountered the malicious Richard Cottingham. They took a bus to the bar, and she was seen on Main Street in Hackensack around 8 p.m. She was reported being seen again around 8:45 with a man at the bus stop, since Richard had offered to accompany her there. This would be the last time Irene Blaze was seen alive. On April 8th, Irene was discovered in Sadie River, face down in water that was about 4 feet deep. She was partially dressed but had not been raped. She was savagely beaten and stabbed through the back and into her right lung. Furthermore, she had been strangled, either with a rope or wire or her own crucifix necklace. It is easy to see here that he had escalated in his vulgar methods. This was the first account we see Richard stabbing one of his victims, and it won't be the last.
On July 14th, 1969, 15-year-old Denise Valeska left her house about 8 p.m. to go to the home of a friend. The route took her along a road near her home. Richard saw her walking and offered her a ride. She accepted and climbed into his car, not understanding the danger she was in. When she did not arrive home by her 11 p.m. curfew, her family got concerned. The following day, on July 15th, Denise's body was found in front of St. Mary's Cemetery. She was naked from the waist up, with her bra loosely hanging around her neck. She had been beaten and sexually assaulted. The chain of her crucifix necklace was used to strangle her. The only major piece of evidence found was a bloody handprint on her thigh. Richard had gotten away with another grisly crime. And this was the first time that Richard had sexually assaulted one of his victims, so you can see his clear line of escalation with these crimes. On October 3rd, 1969, Richard was arrested for a DUI. He was ordered to spend 10 days in jail and pay a $50 fine. Despite the double life Richard was leading, he managed to keep some aspects of normality. He met a woman named Janet, and on May 3rd, 1970, Richard and Janet married at Our Lady of Lourdes Church in Queens Village, New York. That same year, they moved into Ledgewood Terrace Apartments in Little Ferry. Richard stayed out of legal trouble for 2 years, but on August 21st, 1972, he was arrested for shoplifting at Stern's department store in Paramus, New Jersey. He was fined $50, but faced no other punishment. In 1973, he was charged with robbery, sodomy, and sexual assault, but this charge was later dismissed. In October of that year, Richard and Janet welcomed their first child, Blair. Richard could not seem to stay out of trouble, even with his growing family taking up a lot of time. On February 12, 1974, he was charged with unlawful imprisonment and robbery, and a couple of months after this, he was charged with sodomy and robbery.
He was just really racking up those charges and clearly was a danger to society.
But each time, the charges were all dismissed, so he never was punished for any of these things, even though they're pretty serious charges. Sexual assault multiple times, robbery multiple times. Yeah, they're serious things. With his behavior putting a strain on his marriage, Richard decided to move his family into a 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood in Lodi, New Jersey. The couple had another child on the way and wanted to make a new start. They had their son, Scott, in March of 1975, and their third and final child, Jenny, was born in October of 1976. In 1977, Richard started an affair with a woman named Barbara Lucas. Adultery was far from the only trouble Richard would create that year.
Only 2 months later, in December, 8 years after the last confirmed murder, Richard strikes again and is much closer to the comforts of his previous home. A woman named Mary Ann Carr, age 26, was working as an X-ray technician. She was last seen around 7:45 p.m. talking to a white male around 30 years old in the parking lot of Ledgewood Terrace Apartments. If you remember us mentioning a moment ago, this is the former residence of Richard Cottingham. Seems he was interested in visiting his old headquarters. Many people thought that Mary Ann was talking to her husband in the parking lot, but he had an alibi for that night. The next morning, December 16th, 1977, Mary Ann Carr was found dead next to a parking lot fence at a local New Jersey hotel. She was still wearing her work uniform from the previous day, and she had her hands and feet bound. There was a 3x2-inch mark on her face that was left from adhesive tape. She had a hemorrhage in her left occipital bone behind her ear and had bruises all over her body. Her hair had been cut, and there was a slit in her left pant leg close to her thigh. After further investigation, the police discovered that her apartment door was unlocked, and she was missing her white shoes, orange-brown leather coat, and neutral-colored purse. The autopsy showed that the official cause of death was mechanical asphyxia, from a combination of the tape over her mouth and the strangulation of something around her neck. Police were really working hard to find out who was responsible for such a brutal attack, but they had no leads for a very long time.
On September 28, 1978, a young woman named Karen Schilt decided to grab a drink after work. She had a long shift at her barmaid job at Tuesday's Bar and Grill and needed some time to relax. She headed to another bar where she met Richard Cottingham, this time using the name John Schaefer. Richard noticed that she was pregnant. Remember, this was a time before it was well known that alcohol could harm unborn babies. And he bought her a drink and slipped drugs into it before handing it to her and waited for the effects to set in. When she started feeling woozy, she decided it was time to leave. She got up to leave the bar and stumbled down the street. Richard followed her and offered her a ride home. She accepted, or at least wasn't in a position to resist, and Richard began his attack. He beat and sexually assaulted her and dumped her into a sewer at none other than the Ledgewood Terrace Apartments. Only a couple of weeks later, on October 10th, Richard met a young sex worker named Susan Geiger at Flanagan's Irish Pub. Using the name Jim, he told her about his life, including his wife and his 3 kids. He bought her a screwdriver because he had found that drink masked the taste of the drugs that he was using to subdue his victims. Once the drugs took hold, Richard assaulted and raped her. He whipped her with a garden hose and spent 2 days torturing her. He left her in a motel room in Hackensack, New Jersey, and she managed to make her way out of the room to get help. Although semen was found in the crime scene, they were not able to find the attacker. Technology at the time only allowed investigators to determine that the assailant had type O blood. After committing murder once again, Richard's personal life didn't seem to improve at all. The following year, in April of 1979, his wife filed for divorce.
Throughout the stress of a divorce and the stress that might put on a person and their family, it didn't seem to faze Richard enough to stop committing murders. On December 1st, 1979, Richard participated in another homicide, but this time he attacked 2 women. Dide Goodarzi, 22, was an immigrant worker from Iran who worked as a prostitute to supply for her 4-month-old daughter. One night, Dida and another sex worker who was about 20 years old and unidentified met up with a client going by the alias Carl Wilson. He had rented a room for them at the Travel Inn Motor Hotel on 22nd Street. Richard tortured Dida and Jane Doe for 2 hours using a knife. The actions of Richard in this double homicide are nothing short of revolting. He stabbed Dida through the back and into her lung and then removed the head, hands, and feet of both women. He then put all of the body parts into a bag and left the hotel room. Supposedly, the cops stopped Richard while he was with the bag of body parts, but he was very good at talking his way out of situations. He told them he was grabbing some food and then was on his way home. Here's some audio of Richard talking about his encounter with the police officers and how he was satisfied with getting away with it.
When I disposed of the heads, I took them out of the hotel. 2 cops pulled me over. They see me with a carry-all bag at 3:30 in the morning. They asked what I was doing. I told them I was staying in the hotel and I'm going to get something to eat. Without batting an eye, they would believe me. They never asked what was in the bag or for any ID or anything like that. And I can make people believe what they wanted to believe. It's hard to describe. It's godlike almost.
After stashing the body parts, he returned to the hotel room and set it ablaze. He put each girl on a bed and covered them in lighter fluid before burning the room and leaving. At 9:15 a.m. on the morning of December 2nd, the fire department arrived at the scene. The first to enter the room was a firefighter named James Rogers. He talked about the event saying, quote, "I'm used to seeing charred bodies, but this was the worst experience I've ever had in 12 years of firefighting. I've never come across something like that. I hope I never do again," end quote. The scene was shocking and seemed to be from the devil himself. Both women had been decapitated and set on fire with lighter fluid, specifically targeting their lower private areas. They had each been sedated with drugs and had cigarette burns on their breasts. One woman had signs of rape. They had bruises all over their bodies, as well as shallow cuts on the torso and legs that were made before and after death. Both of their clothes were folded neatly in the bathtub, except for the jewelry belonging to Dita. It was missing along with their body parts. Police searched intensively for the identity of the Jane Doe, even putting up posters with her clothes, but nobody came forward about her identity. Richard was proud of himself for what he had done. He showed no remorse. In fact, a coworker remembered talking to Richard about the double homicide and asking who could have done this, and Richard responded with, quote, "I don't know, could have been you, could have been me," end quote.
Almost a month later in the same year, Richard was prowling Times Square. It's important to remember that Times Square in the 70s and 80s was not like it is today. It was a more seedy place full of sex shops, clubs, and prostitution, and Richard spent a lot of time there. He was well versed in the practices of this time and place, and he came across a teen sex worker named Helen Sykes. He abducted her and took her into Queens. Richard brutalized Helen and mutilated her body. He nearly beheaded her and severed her legs, which were found a block away. This is more evidence of the escalation of Richard's crimes. In 1980, he started another extramarital affair, this time with a woman named Jean Connolly. On May 4th of 1980, Richard set his sights on another teen sex worker, Valerie Ann Street. She had only been in New York for 4 days and had already been manipulated into sex work by the predators trolling for new girls to exploit. Richard took her back to the Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, and he spent almost 24 hours torturing and raping her. He viciously bit her on her breasts and cut her breasts, sternum, and abdomen. He beat her on her shins, head, and face before ultimately strangling her with a ligature. Her body was found beneath the mattress by a hotel maid. She was found with her hands bound behind her and her clothes were missing. Police connected this to Marianne Carr's case due to the location of the bodies being found and the similarities in the attack. A little over a week later, Richard drugged and assaulted another woman, Pamela Weisenfeld. The attack again included savage biting over her body, and he dumped her in the parking lot of Teaneck, New Jersey, but thankfully she survived. 3 days later, on May 15th, 1980, Richard picked up another sex worker, this time 25-year-old Jean Rayner. He invited her back to his hotel room at the Hotel Seville, and she accepted. Once in the room, Richard ambushed her. Again, he spent time torturing and raping her. He stabbed her multiple times and mutilated her body. He cut off her breasts and placed them on the bed frame, and finally strangled her. After sanitizing the room, he set the body on fire. Connections were being made across a lot of these victims at this point, and New York was getting kind of nervous about all of these women showing up mutilated. People started referring to the killer as the Times Square Killer or the New York Ripper.
On May 22nd, 1980, an 18-year-old sex worker, Leslie Ann Odell, was soliciting on the corner in New York. She had only arrived in the city a few days prior. Unfortunately, she was picked up by Richard Cottingham. She decided to confide in him and confess that she was a victim of sex trafficking and her pimp had taken advantage of her. They talked until 3 a.m. and got some food at a diner, and Richard said that he would take her to a bus terminal to escape. Before taking her to the bus terminal, he said he would pay her $100 for sex. Richard checked them into the same inn that Valerie Ann was found at. Richard had a new habit of going to old hunting grounds, and it was going to be a mistake that got him caught. Once inside the room, Richard offered to give Leslie a back massage and ended up putting a knife to her throat and handcuffed her. He told her that he was going to torture her and degrade her. He proceeded to bite, rape, and beat her. Leslie screamed as loud as she could, thankfully attracting the attention of staff members who went to the room around 9:30 in the morning. They went to the room, still paranoid after finding Valerie's body only a couple of weeks prior, and Richard told Leslie to open the door and tell the employees that everything was fine. With a knife held to her side, she did as he said. She told the staff members that everything was okay, but moved her eyes quickly from side to side, indicating that something was wrong. The staff immediately ran to call the police, who arrived quickly to the scene. Richard tried to flee out of the fire escape, but he was caught. In the room, they found handcuffs, a gag, collars, a switchblade, fake pistols, and many prescription pills. This was just what the police needed to see to arrest Richard Cottingham.
Richard initially denied everything. He told police that Leslie was a sex worker and had agreed to do anything for $180. Police kept pushing, even trying to feed into his narcissism so they could get the information that they needed. At first, all he said was, quote, "I have a problem with women," end quote. Eventually, he started to concede some details. He said that his attack on Leslie was because he was upset about his divorce, and that's why it was so brutal. He only referred to Leslie as the quote-unquote female subject, which showed his detachment. Looking at the condition of Leslie's body after her ordeal, it was clear it was way more methodical of an attack, and when confronted with this, Richard stopped talking and asked for a lawyer. Police searched Richard's home and found many trophies from his victims in a private room in his basement. Among these were pieces of jewelry, undergarments, and the key to Marion Carr's apartment, and even a koala toy that belonged to Valerie Street. In June of 1980, Richard's wife took the 3 kids and moved to Poughkeepsie, New York. With Richard facing so many charges, he had to bounce around the court system between jurisdictions a lot, so this next part might be a little confusing, but bear with me. On August 14th of that year, Richard was formally charged with the murders of Jean Rayner, Dita Godarzi, and the Jane Doe. On September 15th, he was identified in a lineup by Susan Geiger and Karen Schilt as their attacker. On September 17th, 1980, Richard was indicted on 21 counts for the murder of Valerie Ann Street and for the assaults of Leslie Odell, Susan Geiger, and Karen Schilt. The trial for those counts started in October of 1980. Richard pled not guilty and was held on a $350,000 bond. He testified at his own trial, which shows his desperation for people to listen to him. It can usually do more harm than good. He talked about his fascination with bondage since childhood, but said he did not find pleasure in hurting people. Leslie bravely took the stand to detail her ordeal and point the finger at Richard Cottingham. Richard denied knowing any of the victims except for Leslie. Since he was caught with her red-handed, it was kind of hard to deny that one. Richard's co-worker took the stand as well and talked about the many times Richard had boasted about the things he had done, including drugging women and robbing them. On June 11th, 1981, Richard was convicted of 15 of these charges. Throughout the trial, Richard appeared calm, occasionally taking notes. But a few days after the trial, Richard attempted suicide by drinking 6 ounces of liquid antidepressant.
A month after being convicted, Richard was officially sentenced to 173 years in state prison. However, it was applied as concurrent terms with his kidnap and assault convictions, meaning about 60 to 95 years in prison, as well as being fined with $2,350. This seems a little cheap for me with how many women that he killed and whatnot, but this could probably be for something else, such as a kidnap or assault charge. On February 25th, 1982, so a year after his sentencing, Richard was being transported to a jail cell to await his trial for the murder of Marianne Carr, but it ended up as a mistrial because he collapsed in transition due to a duodenal ulcer. So the trial ended up being conducted at the beginning of October in 1982. During the trial for the murder of Mary Ann Carr, Richard tried to escape but was unsuccessful. I can just imagine him trying to run out of the courtroom and getting tackled. He was caught quickly by authorities and 8 days later was convicted of the second-degree murder of Mary Ann Carr in a non-jury trial. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, plus a minimum of 30 years had to be served consecutively with the previous conviction of Valerie Ann Street and the assaults. 5 months after his second conviction, he was transferred to a detention center in Manhattan, New York to await trial for the 1980 charges, so we're backtracking now, to the triple homicide of Dita Godarzi, Jane Doe, and Jean Rayner. So these were the people he was initially charged with their homicide, but the trial for the conviction hadn't happened yet. The long-awaited trial started in July 1984. Richard was one for theatrics in the courtroom, as we have seen. He ran away during the Mary Ann Carr trial, and in this triple homicide trial, he attempted suicide in front of the jury by cutting his forearm. Ultimately, he was convicted of the triple homicide and sentenced to an additional 75 years in prison, where he belongs. Richard's sisters and mistresses all stood by him throughout all 3 of the trials, which is a little abnormal to me, but there's a lot of different trauma bonding things that you have to take into consideration. Since 2004, investigators have dedicated a lot of time trying to get Cottingham to confess about the murders that he had committed, but it seems like pulling teeth. Since he just craves that attention, he makes it very difficult. In September 2010, just 10 years ago, Richard did plead guilty to the murder of Nancy Vogel, the very, very, very first victim that we talked about, whose case had to wait 43 years for closure, whose family had to wait 43 years for closure. Even though Richard offered an apology to the Vogel family, it is unclear if his intentions were genuine.
Nadia Fazani, a French-Canadian journalist and criminologist that specialized in serial killers, took an interest in Richard's case. She had begun writing letters to many well-known serial killers, such as Joel Rifkin and Patrick Kearney. She began writing letters to Richard, and the two struck up a correspondence. Richard would send birthday cards and even mention that he loved her in a letter. He signed his letters Richie and obviously appreciated the attention he was getting. In the letters, Richard said that he was in prison for 5 murders, but the number was actually a lot higher than Nadia's age, which was 30 at the time. He told her that he had started killing 12 years before the known murders. The documentary that details the interaction Nadia and Richard had occurred before the murders of Nancy, Jacqueline, Irene, or Denise were known. So at this point, the first known murder was in 1977. This means that Richard was saying he started killing around 1965. Even with what we know now, with Nancy's case being the first, that means that there were victims earlier than even Nancy, if we're to believe his account. This also brings me back to thinking about that 8-year gap he supposedly took in killing. I just don't believe that. I don't think that he would have gone that long without killing, especially because he was getting in trouble during that time for sexual assaults and robberies and things like that. I just cannot imagine that he stopped for 8 years. I think there are potentially a lot more victims in that time that just haven't been connected yet. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Maybe he'll confess to some more. Nadia Fazani went to the hotel where Dita and the Jane Doe were killed and even stayed in the very room where the crime took place. Nadia also talked to the doctor that performed the autopsy on Dita and the Jane Doe, and he said there were many superficial knife wounds that were clear marks of torture. Nadia was the first person in 30 years to interview Richard Cottingham, and we have some of the audio of that we'll play for you now.
I enjoyed it. It was a game. It's scary to a girl to have something done like that, to be so close to a knife, so to speak, pressed against you. The situations that I was seeking were more of a power trip. The power of holding someone's fate in your hands is a very powerful aphrodisiac. The adrenaline rush is like nothing. I mean, you're in complete control of somebody's destiny.
How did you actually get to cut off their heads and hands?
Very easy, with a hacksaw. That was done only to prevent identification. It was an ego trip.
Can Can you tell me why you cut off the breasts of one victim?
To do something different. I mean, she was already dead. I mean, it wasn't something that she was alive. And I wanted to create a sensationalism. It's not hard. It's just a body. I mean, it's not a living person no more. No feeling. I forgot, like it didn't happen. I could put myself into a zone to do something like that. And it would be like remote control.
So how many victims do you think you have?
Oh, I know exactly how many.
How many?
Over 85. Under 100. I was doing this for years. Hardly a week or two went by without something happening.
So you're saying you were killing a victim every week?
Every couple of weeks on average.
For how many years?
I can't tell you that. But well over 10.
Would you have continued to kill if you hadn't been arrested by the police?
Definitely. Definitely.
So as you heard, Richard said he liked the power and that mutilating bodies was sometimes done as a forensic countermeasure, but also sometimes he did it just because it was something different. Which, just the way he talks about it, you can tell how much he craves attention.
Now we're going to talk about a woman named Jennifer Weiss. This woman was adopted as a baby, and she came forward that she was the daughter of Dita Goodarzi, one of the victims of Richard Cottingham's double homicide. She found out in her 20s when she started searching for information about her biological family, and she found out that her birth mother had been killed by a serial killer, and it was really shocking for her, but she started learning more about the man who did it. She watched Nadia Fazani's documentary and became more interested in the case. She found out that Richard had been visiting her mother as a client for 2 years prior to her death, and she believed it was possible, but not probable, that Richard is her biological father. But they haven't done any DNA tests, and everything remains a little fuzzy on that. She eventually reached out to Richard Cottingham and started writing him letters in 2017. This was 10 years after learning about who he was. She waited so long because she had been recovering from breast cancer, and so she's just spent time recovering with family and doing some research of her own before reaching out. Sooner or later, she ended up visiting him in prison in hopes to learn more about her mother and find out where her mother's skull may be. Richard told her that Dita's skull was at the base of the George Washington Bridge, but this hasn't been confirmed. Jennifer was sure that Richard was lying about killing so many women and believed that he was just telling them what they wanted to hear for sensationalism. Richard says he only mutilated the women to throw off law enforcement, but since there's so many similarities between the multiple crimes, this is not easily believed, as we mentioned before. She knows that he now goes to church and watches TV to keep himself busy, and Jennifer says he has told her a lot more about cases that haven't been released to the public. This seems a little confusing for me. If you know more about the cases, you should inform police or the public or someone that he has informed you more about certain things, but as far as I know, she hasn't released anything. Over time, Jennifer continued to visit him and even formed a friendship with Richard Cottingham. Jennifer said, quote, "What meant more was that he is a human being. I had to go there with love and respect, and I had to respect this whole man because he was put on this planet to do all these tragic things." End quote. I don't really believe that people are put on earth to do tragic things. I believe you're put on earth to spread positivity, not necessarily spread evil. Richard has apologized to her and said he wished he could change the past. Jennifer says she is trading friendship for information about the crimes, but I feel like this is really just an excuse so she can talk to him all the time. She refers to him as a father figure, and you wouldn't be calling him a father figure or a dad if it was someone you were just trying to get information off of. Jennifer says, quote, "I'd love to sort through the mess he made. It's like, come on, Dad, we got to pick up these pieces because he's so old. Sometimes when I talk to him, I'll say, hey, Pops, to bring him back to let's do this for humanity because he has no desire to do anything for humanity." End quote. Jennifer got involved with a book on Richard Cottingham with a man named Peter Vronsky and started a quote-unquote restorative justice program called Serial Killers Need Hugs Too. Lots of things about all of that just kind of rubs me the wrong way, I guess. But I understand that everyone has their different opinions and their different perspectives on certain cases and certain criminals and the positions that people are in and the decisions that they've made. It just isn't something that really sits well with me.
I definitely agree. Richard Cottingham did not admit to the murders of Jacqueline Harp, Irene Blaze, or Denise Falesko until 2020, so very recently. Before this, he was eligible for parole in 2025, not that he stood much of a chance of that, but these new confessions likely throw that off. Richard has claimed several times that he's killed between 85 and 100 people. As of today, there are 9 murders conclusively linked to him. And as you heard, he wants to be known as a prolific serial killer, so I feel like the high numbers might just be him trying to sound worse because he likes being known for that. But at the same time, he did do a lot of really horrible stuff, so it's not like he's not capable of committing many more murders. And he killed so many women in such horrible ways. So I fully believe that there are more victims out there that haven't been identified yet, but I don't know if I believe that the number would be that high. Kind of an interesting side note, the 1970s were a huge decade for serial killers in the US. Many of the most popular cases come from that era. And it's strange to think about, but during the same time Richard Cottingham was murdering women in New York, at least 3 other serial killers were also operating and killing in the New York and New Jersey areas. Richard Kuklinski, Arthur Shawcross, and David Berkowitz, also known as Son of Sam, were all actively killing in the same place at the same time as Richard Cottingham.
Yeah, that's like insane to me. I probably would have packed up and moved if that many missing people were happening all the time in New York and New Jersey. Obviously, there's something going on back then. But we are actually going to be talking about Richard Kuklinski in our next book club episode, because the book right now that everyone is reading is The Iceman, The Confessions of a Contract Mafia Killer. I am so excited to talk about this case. Richard Kuklinski is probably one of the most interesting cases to me that I have looked into. And I don't think it's just because of him. I think I just love learning about organized crime. Like when we researched our episode on Chuck Morgan, that was such an interesting episode and interesting information. And if you haven't heard about that one, go watch that episode. Just organized crime is very strange and kind of baffles me in a way that it even happens. So I love learning about it, and Richard Kuklinski was definitely one of those cases. So if you haven't been doing the book club, or maybe you just haven't started the book this month, oh my goodness, please get on that. You will be baffled by what you read.
Yeah, definitely be sure to read that one and join us as we talk about it. Let us know your thoughts. Let us know any opinions you have about the book or the story or anything that Kuklinski did. It's definitely a wild one.
This is also our first nonfiction book club episode, so it's going to have a different layout than the other episodes we've done, since we don't really have to just relate it to true crime. It is true crime. So it's going to have a little bit different of an outline, but there's going to be so much to talk about. So we really hope you guys join us for that one.
So that pretty much wraps up our episode for today. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you found this story as interesting as we did. Make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter for all the updates, and we'll share information about other cases and kind of interact with you guys more. We really like the community and we like hearing your thoughts on things. Don't forget to visit our website, theabysspod.com, for information about what we do and the cases we've covered and all kinds of things like that. And make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode.
Thanks for diving into the abyss with us again.
Bye.
This a puppy dog.
He said,
He just like butts his way into doors. He's a hard-headed thing. Think about it. He hits his head on the table. He headbutts doors.
Dirkowitz. His name is Berkowitz. I said David Dirkowitz.
He's a Dirk. David Dorkowitz.
David Dorkowitz.